extraordinary collection of visionaries, renegades, and child geniuses. For 2 decades, they engaged in bitter rivalries and legal disputes, all wrapped in international intrigue, to become the leading lights in a burgeoning new global industry. Today, that multi-billion-dollar industry generates more revenue worldwide than Hollywood. It's expected to topple even the music industry as the most lucrative entertainment business on the planet. The business, computer games. It all began in 1972 with a group of Silicon Valley rebels who quit their mundane engineering jobs to pursue a dream. Their founding father was 28-year-old Nolan Bushnell, who bluffed his way into business with just $500 in capital. He set up a company named after a key move in his favorite Japanese board game, Go.
In Japanese, when you're about to engulf an opponent's group, you politely warn them Atari. And I thought that was a good aggressive name for a company.
Despite his chronic lack of funds, Bushnell set out to recruit Atari's first game designer.
Nolan showed up one day and took me to lunch in his bright, shiny new Oldsmobile station wagon and offered me $1,000 a month salary and some stock in the company. The Vietnam War was going on. I was pretty much questioning authority, and if you told me I couldn't do something, I was going to do it. Off I went. When we started Atari, it was the first thing we walked into this empty building. It was kind of a scary feeling in a little company with no support. There were just 3 of us there. Wow, this is the old place.
Here, in this small workshop, Pong, the first great computer game, was born.
That's where I sat and wired the first Pong machine.
Pong was actually started as really a training project.
He stretched the truth a little bit, told me he had a big contract from General Electric.
No engineer wants to work on a throwaway project.
The fact that nobody from General Electric ever called or came by or wrote us a letter never occurred to me. This might not be true.
The first thing that Al did was to get the paddles to work, then the ball to move. And then we added the feature that where the ball impacted the paddle would determine the angle that it would bounce off. And at that change, the game was fantastically fun.
But would the public agree? Bushnell and Alcorn installed their hastily assembled prototype in their local tavern to find out.
We put it in a wooden box that had sticky-backed contact paper on it. I mean, it was real tacky. Slapped a coin box from an old kiddie ride on the side of it and put it on top of a barrel.
We sat back, got a beer, sat by a pinball machine, and watched what happened.
One of the regulars approached the machine and studied the ball bouncing silently around the screen. He inserted a quarter and the game began. Eventually, he realized that 2 small knobs controlled the paddles and played his first shot. A small crowd gathered round to watch. Bushnell and Alcorn watched for a while and then headed home.
The next day, they called in and said the machine's broken, and we said, oh no. The machine was opened, and we found that the problem was that it was so full of quarters it wouldn't take anymore. I thought, that's a problem we can solve.
When Nolan saw how well the Pong was doing, how much money it was making, he said to himself, I got a hit on my hands, and we're going to go into manufacturing.
Atari was on its way. Bushnell rented the cheapest space he could find, an abandoned skating rink, and they set up their first factory.
Everybody in the company, when I said we're going to build 100 machines a day, said, Nolan, you're absolutely crazy.
We knew so little about it, we actually went to the unemployment office and actually just hired people off the street, and there were parolees, there were bad guys. It was pretty shocking how amateur it was.
Within 6 weeks to 2 months, we were at 100 machines a day.
Word got round and the orders for Pong started flooding in. 10,000 cabinets for the US alone.
It just took the country by storm. We were 24 years old and not far out of college, and we'd done something that already touched the world.
On an initial investment of $500, Atari made its first million. But trouble lay ahead for the fledgling company. Storm clouds were gathering, even as the profits soared. The new computer game company Atari was hitting the big time. Greater success would soon follow when they thought of taking their game Pong out of the arcades and into the home.
I felt that the home game market could potentially be huge. Al came to me one day and said, I think we can put this all on a chip and build it cheap enough that we can go into the home. And I said, let's do it.
This is one of the actual first Pong chips, so all the logic that was in the coin-op game, these chips cost us, $10 a piece, and we could build a game and sell it for $100.
Finding someone to sell the home version of Pong was a tougher challenge.
We could not get a single toy store anywhere in the nation to buy any. And then one of our guys thought, well, let's try the sporting goods department at Sears.
Bushnell and Alcorn were asked to demonstrate their prototype at Sears head office, the Sears Tower in Chicago.
The table was filled with executives, but these guys were not high-tech executives. And the boss, Carl Lind, the division manager, his previous claim to fame was the air-conditioned electric blanket. And so I hook up to the TV set and it's not working. I can't see any picture.
The problem, Alcorn realized, was that they were sitting a few floors below the most powerful television mast in Chicago.
So I had to open the bottom of the box up and retune it to some other channel. And they could see all the wire wraps inside so I get it all buttoned up, get it working, play the game, blip, blip, blip. Carl Lind, the boss, looks at me, he leans to the table, he says, Mr. Alcorn, you tell me you're gonna take that rat's nest of all those wires in there and put them on a little tiny piece of silicon the size of your fingernail? I go, yes, sir. How are you gonna solder the wires to it?
Eventually, the Sears executives were convinced.
He asked us, how many can you build? So we huddled outside and said, how many do you think? He said, about 25,000. And so I went back in and I said to the Sears buyer, I said, about 75,000. I figured 3 to 1. Then not to be outdone, he came back with an order for 150,000. And at that point, we said, well, there's no way we can afford to build those. We just don't have enough money. And he says, oh, not to worry. I'll introduce you to Sears Bank.
Sears ordered 150,000 units of Pong to be delivered in time for Christmas 1975. It was make or break time for Atari again. Sears put their marketing might behind Pong, and a frenzy of anticipation built up. The 1973 arcade sensation was now available as the ultimate home entertainment.
One commercial ran, and they were completely sold out. And that was wonderful. Slowly but surely, we built new games, different games. We just took this attitude that we were going to give our competitors no safe quarter. And we outmarketed them, we outbuilt them, we out-innovated them.
Bushnell was determined to stay ahead of new rivals. To make the best games, Bushnell needed to attract the best engineers. So he decided to make working at Atari fun, the most fun company on the planet. He installed a hot tub in the new offices.
I remember Nolan and me in the hot tub with some engineers and some lady engineers, and in walks a brand new engineer hire with his parents. And he's saying, and there's the chairman of the board, and there's the VP of engineering. And his parents were like shocked, and we were, hey, come on in, take your clothes off, it's fun, we had a good time.
We felt that we wanted to be able to recruit anybody that we wanted. One of the things that we could do is have it look like this is really a cool place to work. We became known as a party company.
New recruit David Crane was a big fan of Bushnell's eccentric approach to running a business.
Neat was a word you heard from Nolan quite often. If he said, "Oh, that's neat," he would want to make it, thinking that if he found it neat, other people would find it neat.
Bushnell inspired his lineup of brilliant young engineers to constantly innovate.
My attitude was that if you personally believe strongly in your idea, give it a try.
The free flow of creativity produced a whole string of hit games, keeping Atari at the top of the industry it had created. But then came the lawsuit. It turned out that computer games had already been invented, 6 years before Atari even existed. A television set designer called Ralph Baer had been thinking about the idea since the early 50s. In 1966, it all came together while he was waiting at a bus stop on a business trip to New York.
When I got back to the office the next morning, it was September 1st, 1966, I wrote a 4-page memo. In it, I lay out the whole thing. I proposed such things as sports games, chase games, race games, car games.
Baer set to work on his invention. By 1968, he had his first television games console working, which he simply called his brown box. His first game was a game in which 2 pixels chased each other around the screen. That was quickly followed by a tennis game, still 4 years before Bushnell and Alcorn came up with Pong. TV manufacturers Magnavox signed up Baer and produced a refined version of the brown box. The Odyssey played 10 different games. Each game came with a color overlay that was stuck on the screen to enhance the primitive graphics. It had controllers, and Baer even came up with the first light gun for shooting games, an invention years ahead of its time. The Odyssey was launched at a trade show in New York in 1972.
It was absolutely the hit of the show, and everybody was very enthusiastic, as was the press.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, 12 exciting electronic games you play through your own TV. Any brand.
At another trade show in Silicon Valley on the 24th of May that year, an interesting name appeared in the visitor's book, Nolan Bushnell.
And he played the Odyssey game hands-on and played the ping pong game.
The fact is that I absolutely did see the Odyssey game, and I saw it and I didn't think it was very clever.
Whether Bushnell was inspired by the Odyssey or not, Ralph Baer had patented his designs.
This is the patent which, and if you look in the fine print up here, you can see that it was first filed January of 1968. There is a television set down here. Underneath is 2 hand controls on each side.
Based on Baer's patents, Magnavox sued Atari.
Our position was always very clear. We said, we will only settle this for less than it'll cost us to defend it.
After 4 years of negotiations, Bushnell and Baer met for the first time on the steps of the federal court in Chicago in 1976. Rather than go before a judge, Bushnell and his lawyer agreed to pay a license fee in recognition of Baer's patents.
Within days, they had an agreement for a prepaid license for a very reasonable amount. He really got away with murder.
Magnavox accepted a settlement of $400,000. Ralph Baer won justice, but none of the international recognition that Bushnell enjoyed.
He was characterized as the father of video games because he was always out there in front of the cameras, and I'm behind the scenes with the lawyers telling me, cool it, Baer, right? He's a licensee, cool it. Right?
25 years on, Ralph Baer has retired, but he's determined to finish his autobiography and set the record straight over the true origins of computer games. For Bushnell, the settlement came cheap. Atari was already making millions. But as computer games entered a golden era of popularity, Atari faced a new threat, what appeared to be an unstoppable world-conquering game from Japan. In 1978, Taito released a game that became so popular in Japan that it caused a nationwide shortage of 100 yen coins. Called Space Invaders, it sold over 350,000 units around the world and triggered a renaissance in the arcade business. Atari responded with their own brand of space-themed games. Nolan Bushnell's team of engineers pioneered a new technology called vector graphics, with a striking new look. In 1979, Asteroids became Atari's all-time bestseller. They followed Asteroids with another massive hit entitled Battlezone. Arcades sprang up everywhere, and teenagers and young adults all over the world spent every spare moment and all their spare cash in them. Parents and politicians began to express their concerns. The press was full of stories from around the world of truancy and delinquency. Arcades were branded as evil dens of iniquity, where kids could be easily led astray. But Atari had a solution. Back in 1975, Atari's engineers had secretly started working on a radical new concept. Known as the VCS, or Video Computer System, it would play arcade games in the relative comfort and safety of home.
So here we have the first prototype of the Atari VCS cartridge video game system. It has all the things you need in a prototype. We had the actual logic wire wrap board here and some joysticks and controls from the tank game. We figured we knew we needed this game, had to play Pong, had to play Tank, and had to do the driving games. And beyond that, we weren't sure what we were going to do with it.
The VCS launched in 1977. Since Atari were the #1 producers of arcade hits, they were able to produce a whole series of must-have VCS conversions. And in 1980, Atari bought the home video game rights to Space Invaders.
Atari Space Invaders are here. Now you can play the world's most popular arcade game in your own home. Space-age action on your own TV screen. Plus, all the excitement.
That Christmas, millions of VCS consoles were sold, just so that teenagers could play Space Invaders at home. Thanks to the overwhelming success of the VCS, Atari's annual revenues passed $1 billion. The company's meteoric rise attracted the attention of major players. Warner Communications made Bushnell an offer he couldn't refuse. They offered $28 million to buy Atari, an extraordinary return on Bushnell's startup capital of $500.
Everyone's gone Atari, the #1 video game.
It was a lot of money in those days. It was more money than I ever thought I'd make.
But it was the beginning of the end for Atari. Bushnell stayed on as chief executive, but was soon at odds with the new management.
We were just launching the VCS, and I said, well, you know, the VCS is over. And they say, what? I said, well, no, you have to think of it that way. And they were horrified.
The new Warner bosses were unimpressed with how the company was run.
They were New Yorkers, and they didn't understand it. They thought it was very, very bizarre. And they set about, piece by piece, really dismantling the corporate culture and fundamentally destroying the company. It was the damnedest thing I'd ever seen.
A series of showdowns with the new bosses eventually, inevitably, led to Bushnell being removed. He was paid off and shown the door. The industry had lost its pioneering visionary. But Atari's problems weren't over. Under the new regime, star designers like David Crane found they were no longer valued for their role in the company's extraordinary success.
There were a lot of promises made that weren't kept.
We had some very key engineers that were doing the cartridges for the home games that were making like $50,000-$60,000 a year. In 3 or 4 months, they'd produce the software for a cartridge that would sell $100 million worth of stuff, and these engineers could do the math.
If they really didn't think we were worth more than the person who put screws in the plastic, then we were at the wrong company.
David Crane and 3 other top designers left Atari and set up their own company, ACTIVISION. After 2 years of legal wrangles with Atari, they won the right to design and publish their own games for the VCS. ACTIVISION produced many of the best-loved VCS titles, and Crane himself designed its most successful game of all, Pitfall.
Every game we developed sold 500,000 units at least, so they were all hits. And then when Pitfall came out and sold many millions of units, it was the biggest. What we were developing at that time with Pitfall was the first platform game.
ACTIVISION rekindled the creative spirit of the early days at Atari, but it also, unwittingly, triggered a disaster.
A lot of business people saw only our success and unfortunately flooded the market with product that nobody wanted to buy.
Atari contributed to a public loss of confidence in computer games with hurriedly produced, poor-quality games like E.T. Millions of copies of this game ended up as landfill. The market for computer games crashed, and in 1983, Warner announced second-quarter losses of over $250 million, and their shares plummeted.
I absolutely regret the Warner sale. I think it was the stupidest thing I ever did.
In 1984, Warner sold off Atari, and the American computer games industry was declared dead. But elsewhere, innovation was still thriving, and a new breed of brilliant game designers and entrepreneurs was about to emerge.
It started as a hobby, and yes, it turned into obsession, turned into a career, I guess.
Twins Philip and Andrew Oliver were typical British teenagers. Their parents didn't allow them to have a television game console, but computers were considered educational. And a whole series of cheap personal computers like the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 came on the market. Thousands of well-intentioned parents bought them, and in doing so, spawned a software industry that now rivals any in the world. In the early 1980s, in classrooms, playgrounds, and bedrooms throughout Britain, teenagers were plotting a revolution. Some of them were about to become millionaires. Aged just 12, the Oliver twins aspired to make games which offered something different to the classic arcade games.
The leading edge was what was happening in the arcades. But the problem with arcades was they had to kind of take your 10p or 20p and give you only 1 minute's worth of fun. Whereas the computer games, kids can play it all evening, every evening if they want.
The Oliver twins taught themselves how to program games on their new computers. In 1982, when they were just 13, they published their first game, Roadrunner. The program for it was published in a magazine so that readers could type it into their own computers.
It was just so cool to be able to sort of go into school and say, look, that's our work, and just like run through it with kind of other kids. It was just blocks of single colours. It kind of raced up the screen and the track moved down the screen, and we used to challenge each other, how long can you last? It slowly got narrower and narrower and twistier with good random in there, so it'd eventually knock you off.
The magazine paid them a token fee for the game. They entered their next game into a designer game competition for a kids' TV show.
We wrote a game, sent it in, and we won first prize, and we appeared on television. And that was kind of great, but it was so funny because they said afterwards, we were the only one that actually sent in a game. They didn't actually mean for people to write games. They wanted you to design on paper, wouldn't it be cool if a character did this and this, whereas we'd actually written a game.
Their hobby was quickly turning into a cottage industry, based in their bedroom at home.
We did a whole series of games here.
First few.
There's this Killer P and KV. There were many times where you just worked straight through the night and you had school in the morning, and we just sort of like break up, like you're going to do all the arrows shooting and boulders dropping, and you're going to do this, and you'd go to sleep and you'd wake up and it's like, oh cool, there's a new feature in the game. We just keep working and working and working, and we were starting to get suspicious when you had birds tweeting at the window and it was getting brighter outside, and you hear the milk float. Yeah.
Publishers distributed their games all over the country and sold them in high street stores. But by the time they were finishing school, the twins were still being paid very little, and their parents thought it was time they got a real career. But one of their teachers at school persuaded their parents to give them 1 year to make a go of it. And a few weeks later, everything changed when they met the Darling brothers. The Darling brothers had also been programming their own games since their early teens. But they were unhappy with the token amounts of money that game companies were offering teenage designers. So they sold their games by mail order, setting up their own company in a spare room at home. They duplicated their games on cassette, printed their own artwork, and eventually sold 1 million copies. In 1985, they set up their own publishing company, CODEMASTERS. And at their first trade show, they met the 18-year-old Oliver twins.
The Oliver twins came in and we sat down and they showed us a demo of one of the games they'd done previously.
They're going, a game like that, yeah, we'll give you £10,000 for it. we were just staggered.
If they've said that their jaws hit the floor and they were very excited, they must have concealed that quite well.
We couldn't get home fast enough, and we just didn't sleep. Within about a month we wrote Super Robin Hood, which went straight to #1. By Christmas we'd sold 100,000 units and made £10,000, and in fact it carried on selling, so we actually made a little bit more. Just couldn't believe it. But of course the minute it started selling we just couldn't stop, so we just started rattling out more games for Codemasters.
It was one of the most successful partnerships in computer game history.
We worked out that 50% of all Codemaster games were actually written by us.
The Oliver twins were also working on a secret project. They wanted to do something new, a game centered on an animated cartoon character. And that character was Dizzy.
We wanted like this fantasy world. I had this idea, we should get the character's face as big as possible on screen to give it a bit of personality. They got an awful lot of fan mail in at Codemasters all about it and asking how do you do this and how do you do that, and every time we went up they go, oh, we got some more fan mail.
Dizzy was an international hit. The games topped bestsellers charts all around the world.
One stage we had different Dizzy games at #1, 2, 3 in the charts, which is a bit like the Beatles of the games industry.
The Oliver twins story was repeated all over the country. Teenage computer game millionaires became national celebrities. The newspapers were full of stories of young whiz kids buying houses, speedboats and sports cars that they weren't even old enough to drive. The result of all this hard labour was a massive creative contribution to game design. These were games designed by gamers for gamers. Thanks to the home computer era, Britain now contributes more game designers and programmers to the games industry than any other country.
I remember saying to a journalist, it's like, one day this will be bigger than TV. Right now, the UK games industry actually has bigger export than the British film and TV put together.
But back in the early 80s, while British teenagers were the stars of the home computer era, new stars were also rising in the East. The centre of the computer industry was soon to shift again, to Japan. Today, the computer games industry that began 30 years ago with Atari on the west coast of America is now dominated by Japan. And it's largely thanks to an extraordinary series of character-based games. Donkey Kong, Mario and Zelda, all developed in the 80s by a single creative genius, Nintendo's Shigeru Miyamoto.
At some point, I realized that games could actually draw out people's emotions. Since then, my own childhood memories have been reflected in my games.
In 1980, Miyamoto took his fertile imagination to a little-known company called Nintendo, based in the ancient capital of Kyoto. For nearly 100 years, Nintendo had been manufacturing Hanafuda, flower cards, traditional Japanese playing cards. But when the company's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, had seen the success of arcade games like Space Invaders, he developed Nintendo into a computer games company. Miyamoto was hired as an artist. He never dreamed he would be asked to make computer games.
Miyamoto was a spacey, flighty, really imaginative artist. The last place he ever expected himself to wind up would be in a big company.
I hated computers. I didn't trust in tangible things like electricity.
The next twist of fate was a crisis call from America. Nintendo had established a small US headquarters in Seattle. The arcade era was booming, with Atari at the forefront, and Nintendo wanted a piece of the action. Nintendo of America had ordered 2,000 units of a hit Japanese game called Radarscope. But in America, the game was a disaster. Head office in Kyoto was asked to create a replacement game. Without a single designer available, it was decided that it was time to give their youngest recruit his big break.
Miyamoto was completely baffled and completely overwhelmed with the idea. He started to do the research. He spent time in arcades and he spent time with kids who were playing games and tried to understand what they were about. And he started to have this vision of video games being more like movies. Why couldn't they tell stories?
So Miyamoto created a simple story and colourful cartoon characters for his groundbreaking new game.
Let me show the first sketch I drew for Donkey Kong. The gorilla escapes from the cage, snatches the girl, and runs away with her. The man chases him, dodging all these barrels with a hammer in his hand. At the end, a hole appears in the ground, and the gorilla falls down, and he dies.
To bring his cartoon characters to life, Miyamoto had to work within the limits of the technology of the time.
All of a sudden there was a question, what kind of hair did this guy have? The problem is if he's falling in a video game, you'd have to have his hair do something that the designers just couldn't deal with at the time, which is inertia would make his hair blow up and it would sort of be sticking up as he was falling down. So the way that Miyamoto solved that problem is he gave him this little red hat.
As a final touch, Miyamoto wrote his own music for the game and it was shipped out to Seattle. It remained to be seen whether Donkey Kong would have more success than the failed Radarscope game it was supposed to replace.
People in America saw this game and thought that the Japanese, their Japanese counterparts were insane.
Fearing the worst, Nintendo's American team decided to try out the game in a local bar, just like Atari's Nolan Bushnell had done with Pong a decade earlier.
A day later, they go back to the Spot Tavern, open the little coin box, and lo and behold, there's $30 in quarters in that little coin box. It's almost overflowing. That says that machine was operating almost every minute that tavern was open, from noon until midnight when it closed that day. And he said, wow, what kind of aberration is this? That's all the market research I need. Let's go.
The company made $100 million in sales in the first year alone. And Donkey Kong went on to become an international superstar through a whole series of games for years to come. Meanwhile, Donkey Kong's original owner, Jumpman, went on to greater fame and fortune. In 1985, the company announced the launch of a new home console for the American market, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. Following in the wake of the collapse of the US games industry, most observers thought Nintendo were crazy. But Nintendo had a secret weapon. Miyamoto took computer games to a whole new level with his next masterpiece, Super Mario Bros. Jumpman was reincarnated as an Italian plumber called Mario.
Mario can do amazing physical things, like high jumps. But he's not superhuman. He drowns in water and gets hurt if he falls from high places.
Miyamoto created a side-scrolling world for him to explore, full of pipes and sewers, as well as ledges and cliffs. And he created an entire army of colourful cartoon monsters.
In the early test version, Mario was very big. Next I created Small Mario. The game became more interesting with both. Then I wondered what kind of magic food could transform Small Mario into Big Mario. So I created that unwholesome looking red mushroom.
He was making these wondrous universes that it was like falling through the looking glass.
The game and its two sequels became some of the best-loved games ever. By 1987, Nintendo's NES console had become the #1 toy in the world. And a survey revealed that more American children recognized Mario than Mickey Mouse. Then Miyamoto unveiled his masterpiece. In 1987, Nintendo released the first of a series of games that has become widely acclaimed as one of the greatest games ever made, the Zelda series. The Legend of Zelda moved beyond platforms and levels. It offered players a vast, magical world to freely roam and explore.
The story begins with a child standing in the middle of a field. He doesn't have a sword or a shield. The player starts by naming the child, but then he has no idea what to do. He wanders around the field looking for things to do. It was a very daring concept back then.
More than any before it, this was a game in which the player would experience a sense of progress, gaining new equipment, becoming stronger and more skilled as the adventure unfolded.
When the child grows up, the player thinks, I used to be scared of this, but now I'm very strong. That's the kind of game I wanted to make.
Taking over 100 hours to play the game to the very end, The Legend of Zelda perplexed, intrigued and consumed players all over the world. It was a sensation that broke all the rules and defined a genre that has dominated game design ever since. By the end of the 80s, Nintendo had sold over 30 million NES consoles, hundreds of millions of games, and it held an extraordinary 85% of the entire world games market. Nintendo had become the ultimate boss of the game industry game. It was about to consolidate that position with a radical new portable game system that would appeal to boys, girls, and even adults, the Game Boy. What was needed was the perfect game to launch it. It soon became clear that they would go to extraordinary lengths to find that game. In the late 80s, a friendship between two game designers was forged behind the Iron Curtain. It was a friendship that would make one of these men famous, the other rich, and make Nintendo's Game Boy the most successful games machine ever. The key to that friendship was a game called Tetris. In 1988, Dutch-born game designer and publisher Henk Rogers was in the business of importing new games to Japan.
I first found Tetris in 1988 at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Which is what I did. I used to go around the shows and find the games that I liked and bring them back to Japan. That was the business I was in. I played it, and then I went away and came back and played it again, and I went away and I came back and played it again. There was a really solid core game there. I just went after the game.
Now living in Seattle, Alexei Pajanov created Tetris in Moscow in 1984. Pajanov was working on artificial intelligence and voice recognition software, and originally designed Tetris as an exercise to test out a new computer.
My interest all the time was in small puzzles and games and all these small mathematical diversions.
Tetris was based on an ancient Roman puzzle called pentamino.
There are 12 different shapes like that, and these are all the possible pieces made out of 5 squares.
Pajitnov's simple version of pentamino had pieces made from 4 squares instead of 5. He called it Tetris, from the Greek word tetra, meaning 4.
When I wrote the procedure which rotates at 90 degrees, I liked you push the keys and the chucks, push the key, chucks, and the idea of the game of real time come to me.
Pajitnov's genius was to make Tetris a race against the clock. Completed lines were cleared from the screen, making it possible to carry on playing almost indefinitely. But as the pieces descended more and more quickly, the challenge got progressively harder.
As the game gets faster, your mind is no longer able to think that fast. Maybe it's your subconscious that's playing Tetris at this point, but it's playing faster than you can actually play. And I think athletes have this. We call it a zone.
Tetris spread like wildfire. A few months later, it was discovered in Hungary by software importer Robert Stein. Stein went to Moscow, where he met Alexei Pajitnov and negotiated a license to publish the game.
For some unknown reason, he gave me his original Tetris. It was licensed to be published on everything. That's what I thought.
Tetris, the computer version of a Russian adaptation of an ancient Roman puzzle, was a smash hit everywhere.
When Tetris invaded the office, productivity went down to 0.
It eventually had to be banned.
In Japan, Henk Rogers released a version for Nintendo's home console.
We released this Tetris at the Christmas of 1988. We ended up selling 3 million.
And that was when Henk Rogers became one of just a handful of outsiders given a sneak preview of the new Game Boy handheld gaming system.
I said, I think I have the perfect game for Game Boy.
But Rogers faced stiff competition from Robert Stein to secure the handheld rights for Tetris.
Excuse me, I discovered this product, so shouldn't I have it?
And so I got on the next plane.
Without realizing it at the time, Rogers and Stein flew out to Moscow on exactly the same day. They stayed in the same hotel, but never saw each other.
The TV doesn't work. The radio doesn't work. Everybody's imagination about what it was like behind the Iron Curtain in those days. All those things were there. It was just very scary.
Rogers went to Moscow knowing nothing about the Soviet Union and speaking no Russian. He knew he was looking for an organization called ELOG, and that was it. To his surprise, he had no difficulty hiring an interpreter who spoke perfect English.
Your name is Allah. All these guys are KGB. There's no way that you're going to get an interpreter who's just there to help you do business.
This is the building,
Yeah, this is the building, right. Every meeting has to be cleared through the KGB. And of course, I came out of the clear blue sky. Finally, Mr. Belikov came down and I explained that I'm the one who published Tetris in Japan. And he said, which machine is this? And I said, it's for Nintendo. He says, but we never gave these rights to anybody. I really thought that I was in deep kimchi for a large part of that time there, the beginning time, because I was, in their eyes, I was a pirate.
Later that morning, Rogers met Alexei Pajitnov.
I introduced our other guest. Our other guest is Mr. Pajitnov, the world-famous Mr. Pajitnov.
World-famous why?
World-famous why? Because in the world...
I am Alexei Pajitnov.
We became friends very quickly, because, when you're talking about game design, you have a common ground to talk about. And his English wasn't that good, but it was good enough.
Henk was the very first person who really loves and understood the game. And that's what I felt immediately.
Everybody, including Alexei in Moscow at this time, was paranoid that any conversation that was being had would be heard by people that shouldn't hear it. So anytime he wanted to really talk to me about something, he would wink, wink, or whatever, and we would go to the park.
Finally, the negotiations for the handheld rights for Tetris began.
gosh, it was 8 to 10 people there, some of whom were definitely KGB, and it was total third degree. I was in that room and they were questioning me about everything.
What Rogers didn't know was that the Russians were also negotiating with Robert Stein in another room in the same building.
My objective was to try to get as much of the licenses, what is left, to be had.
Unknown to Stein or Rogers, the chairman of UK publishers Mirasoft, Kevin Maxwell, son of newspaper magnate Robert Maxwell, was also in Moscow.
Kevin was pulling strings. He's saying, if you don't do this deal with me, my dad's going to talk to Gorbachev and you guys are going to be in deep trouble. And that was his negotiating method.
But Rogers had Pajanov on his side, and he had Nintendo's support to offer a generous deal.
4 days of negotiation and finally they said yes.
The deal was signed and Pajanov and Rogers celebrated in the only Japanese restaurant in Moscow.
I hated him, and yet he just done what any businessman would have done, you know. Today, I have lost God knows how many millions of dollars, and I wasn't very happy about it.
The biggest winner was Nintendo. With Tetris as its packed-in game, 32 million Game Boys were sold around the world. As a Soviet citizen, Alexei Pajanov earned nothing from the game, but he became world famous and emigrated to the United States. In 1996, when the original deals expired, Pajanov finally earned his first royalties from the game. He and Henk Rogers are now in business, selling Tetris to a new generation of gamers on a new generation of hardware. With Tetris, the game industry finally came of age, and it made Nintendo, for a while at least, the most powerful entertainment company on the planet. From humble beginnings, computer game culture has evolved at an incredible rate, thanks to the vision and creativity of its pioneers. They understood how much we like, perhaps even need, to play games and explore new worlds. It's virtual living, and it's virtually unstoppable.